Yeah, so again, we, for those of you who were here yesterday, we come back to psych as an example, and I want to emphasize that when we say in this context, we're looking backwards, we're looking in the rearview mirror. When we use when we mention symbolic systems, we don't reference symbolic systems in general. We are talking about old-fashioned symbolic systems of the 70s and a little bit into the 80s, expert systems, the kinds of systems that are built by writing an enormous amount of rules by hand that then culminate in some sort of a first order predicate logic or some equivalent big tree, an ontology that is then used as the basis for what the systems do. So this is really a limited view, and I would really not want to imply here that we somehow don't like symbolic systems, because I really think ultimately that's the way to go, because I don't believe in number soups, which I think journalists are. But I don't really have time to go into that right now. I just wanted to clarify this, because we're really looking in the rearview mirror. We're just looking back and seeing, like, where has this term understanding come from, and where's it going, where is it right now? So we talked just briefly about psych, and then I'll move on to our conceptualization of understanding as a kind of a backdrop for the rest of the talk. So the main goal of psych, for those of you who don't know this, was to create a system. Well, psych comes from encyclopedia. The idea was, let's build an automated encyclopedia that does some stuff on its own, that uses a vast amount of knowledge that you might find in, for instance, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and can answer arbitrary questions based on that knowledge, and do arbitrary things, based on goals that you give it. There was a hypothesis set out in the beginning that, and I do believe this comes from Minsky actually originally, although I'm not a historian, so I haven't really been digging around too much. But there was this hypothesis that once you get to 1 million axioms, or 1 million rules, roughly speaking, the system would know enough to start bootstrap its own knowledge acquisition. This was clearly stated in the early papers. And when they reached 1 million, it really didn't do that, so then they upped it to 2 million. And I believe it's now still growing, and it's at 5 million axioms, and it's still not really working properly in that respect. So this is an interesting historical fact, but of course, you have to remember that psych is a really unique effort in the history of AI. So it's not really a good foundation. It's not experimental evidence, really. We have to dig deeper and think harder to really understand what this means. So we're trying to do just a little bit, like a tiny sliver of that here. And of the things that we can say about it for the topic of understanding, I think these are the interesting things. So first, actually, is the second bullet. Understanding has actually been rewritten as common sense, and now the whole emphasis is on common sense. The system was not actually provided with any special mechanisms for automatic knowledge acquisition. Somehow they imagined that this would just happen automatically. Maybe the system would do it in the same way that humans encode it by hand, which for using knowledge representations with human level semantics built in would kind of give you the idea, now that we think about it, should have given you the idea that maybe the semantics are just too complex for a machine to use, because it's actually a prerequisite for using these representation languages is actually human level intelligence. But that's what we wanted to build, right? So but I'm using psych, and I'm talking really critically of psych. It's not really just psych. I mean, it's a stand-in for this whole methodology. And I think we actually went through this topic yesterday, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But basically, our conclusion is common sense really isn't understanding, and specifically, or more importantly, it certainly isn't general understanding. And I'll get to what that means. So before we go into our conceptualization of understanding, I want to mention the methods by which you would measure understanding, because these actually turn out to be quite important. So first, to be of interest to the AI enterprise, any mechanism, if you could call understanding a mechanism, will have to be useful. And I do believe the consensus is basically based on the disinterest in this phenomenon. The consensus seems to be that it's not that useful for AI. But I really disagree with that. However, to really show that it's actually useful.
The consensus among whom, are you saying?
Well, the majority, let's say. It certainly might not be 90% of this room. I don't know, but we'll see that hopefully in the afternoon session. But to really emphasize how it can be useful, what we've come up with here are ways for testing understanding, and this is really a fundamental aspect of our approach. So prediction, everyone talks about prediction, right? This is in science and in AI, everyone talks about prediction. So this is a given. I mean, we agree with that. Your understanding of something isn't really understanding if you can't predict things. So if you have a phenomenon and you want to test whether someone understands it, one way to do that is to see if they can predict what's going to happen to it if you do X or Y. Another is achieving goals with respect to, so for instance, if you understand driving, you should be able to avoid crashing into things, and you should be able to explain what to do to the steering wheel if suddenly there's a person in front of your car and it's moving towards you. Third, you should be able to explain things. So to highlight the important parts for a particular scenario or operation on this phenomenon, you should be able to separate out what's unimportant to the things that are important. For instance, is my eye color important for the fact that I'm not jet lagged? I don't think so. What is important, what is irrelevant, and what's relevant is really part of understanding. And it can be used to test understanding. And the fourth one is kind of in relation, in reference to the scientific enterprise, and Richard Feynman, who wrote on his wrote on his blackboard some days perhaps before he died, that what I cannot recreate, I do not understand, something along those lines. So recreating here does not mean, you know, I can fashion a mini solar system and that proves that I understand the solar system. No. It means that I can present some explanations and models of this phenomenon that I can recreate its behavior, even if it's in a computation or in a simulation. So take any phenomenon, and phi here can be defined to any phenomenon. It's a set of, let's say, things in the natural world, like a camera or a microphone or an electronic circuit, and this thing may have some behaviors. Okay, it can be a thing, it could be an event, it could be anything. You can map phi onto anything, and it's part of the world. And it's made up of sub-elements of various kinds. These elements have some relations. and these relations couple the parts of the phenomenon together. This can be either hypothetical things or physical things, or you know, literature, things from literature, movies, whatever. So a definition of understanding then in our conceptualization is a set of models of that phenomenon that together describe the phenomenon and allow you to explain the phenomenon, predict the phenomenon, produce effective plans, and achieve goals with respect to the phenomenon, and ultimately recreating it in some compact form, like E equals mc squared, for instance. So the third one actually here, C, is really important and is very much ignored in AI because, well, I don't know why, but basically to achieve goals with respect to anything, you need to understand the causal relationships between the subparts of the phenomenon. So if you see that there's a correlation between rapes in Central Park and ice cream sales, you might suggest, if you don't understand what's going on, that you ban all ice cream sales in Central Park. So you have to be able to tease apart the causal relationships between the parts of the phenomenon you're trying to understand in order to effectively achieve goals with respect to that. And then the second part, and this is just 2 slides really, an agent's understanding of a phenomenon depends on the quality of these sets of models. In terms of completeness, are there any missing relationships, for instance, or are there any missing sub-phenomena that need to be represented? And the accuracy of the representation. So what we have here is a fairly high-level conceptualization of what understanding means, and it gives us this gradient that Pei talked about from low or little understanding to, or no understanding, to high levels of understanding. But with regards to the natural world, I agree with Pei. There isn't really any end to, you don't ever, for any reasonably interesting phenomenon, you don't really stop and have a complete understanding of it. You just have an incrementally better and better understanding. But because phi can be defined as anything, I do think there is such a thing as completeness. You can have, if you just define phi as small as sufficiently small, you can have a complete understanding of phi, because it's just defined as a very small set. Now, this is this footnote. So deepening or broadening of understanding really involves a process by which these models are built. And the main way to do that is, and that here again I agree with Pei, through experience. In the physical world, there are no axioms. We cannot be sure that the sun comes up tomorrow. We cannot be sure that the next second this room will exist. We are pretty sure it will because of experience. That's the only reason. So, yeah, let me move on. So now Dave is going to take over and talk a little bit about Searle's Chinese room in light of this.
So